to each other in front and behind, but their central parts are joined together in the middle line. The anterior parts are called the columns of the fornix, the intermediate united portions the body, and the posterior parts the crura. The body, corpus fornicus, of the fornix is triangular, narrow in front and broad behind. The medial part of its upper surface is connected to the septum pellucidum in front and to the corpus callosum behind. The lateral portion of this surface forms part of the floor of the lateral ventricle and is covered by the ventricular epithelium. Its lateral edge overlaps the choroid plexus and is continuous with the epithelium covering of the structure. The undersurface rests upon the thylakoidea of the third ventricle, which separates it from the epithelial roof of that cavity and from the medial portions of the upper surfaces of the thalami. Below, the lateral portions of the body of the fornix are joined by a thin triangular lamina named a psalterium, lyra. This lamina contains some transverse fibers which connect the two hippocampi across the middle line and constitutes a hippocampal commissure. Between the psalterium and the corpus callosum is a horizontal cleft, the so-called ventricle of the fornix. Ventricle of Verga is sometimes found. The columns, columna fornicus, anterior pillars, fornicolumns, of the fornix arch downward in front of the interventricular foramen and behind the anterior commissure, and each descends through the gray substance in the lateral wall of the third ventricle to the base of the brain, where it ends in the corpus mammillare. From the cells of the corpus mammillare, the thalamo-mammillary fasciculus, bundle of Vic d'Azur, takes origin and is prolonged into the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. The columns of the fornix and the thalamo-mammillary fasciculus together form a loop resembling the figure 8, but the continuity of the loop is broken in the corpus mammillare. The column of the fornix is drawn by the stria medullaris of the pineal body and by the superficial fibers of the stria terminalis, and is said to receive also fibers from the septum pellucidum. Zuckerkandl describes an olfactory fasciculus which becomes detached from the main portion of the columns of the fornix and passes downward in front of the anterior commissure to the base of the brain, where it divides into two bundles, one joining the medial stria of the olfactory tract, the other joins the subcallosal gyrus, and through it reaches the hippocampal gyrus. The crura, crus fornicus, posterior pillars, of the fornix are prolonged backward from the body. They are flattened bands, and at their commencement are intimately connected with the undersurface of the corpus callosum. Diverging from one another, each curves around the posterior ends of the thalamus and passes downward and forward into the inferior cornu of the lateral ventricle. Here it lies along the concavity of the hippocampus, on the surface of which some of its fibers are spread out to form the alveus, while the remainder are continued as a narrow white band, the fimbria hippocampi, which is prolonged into the uncus of the hippocampal gyrus. The inner edge of the fimbria overlaps the fascia dentata hippocampi, dentate gyrus, from which it is separated by the fimbrio-dentate fissure. From its lateral margin, which is thin and ragged, the ventricular epithelium is reflected over the choroid plexus as the lateral projects to the choroidal fissure. Interventricular foramen, foramen of Monro. Between the columns of the fornix and the anterior ends of the thalami, an ovular aperture is present on either side. This is the interventricular foramen, and through it, the lateral ventricles communicate with the third ventricle. Behind the epithelial lining of the foramen, the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricles are joined across the middle line. The anterior commissure, precommissure, is a bundle of white fibers connecting the two cerebral hemispheres across the middle line and placed in front of the columns of the fornix. On sagittal section, it is oval in shape, its long diameter being vertical and measuring about 5 millimeters. Its fibers can be traced lateralward and backward on either side beneath the corpus striatum into the substance of the temporal lobe. It serves in this way to connect the two temporal lobes, but it also contains decussating fibers from the olfactory tracts. The septum pellucidum. Septum lucidum is a thin, vertically placed partition consisting of two laminae separating, in the greater part of their extent by a narrow chunk or interval, the cavity of the septum pellucidum. It is attached above to the undersurface of the corpus callosum, below to the anterior part of the fornix behind, and the reflected part of the corpus callosum in front. It is triangular in form, broad in front and narrow behind. Its inferior angle corresponds with the upper part of the anterior commissure. The lateral surface of each lamina is directed towards the body and anterior cornu of the lateral ventricle, and is covered by the ependema of that cavity. The cavity of the septum pellucidum cavum septum pellucidum, pseudocele, fifth ventricle, is generally regarded as part of the longitudinal cerebral fissure, which has become shut off by the union of the hemispheres and the formation of the corpus callosum above and the fornix below. Each half of the septum therefore forms part of the medial wall of the hemisphere and consists of a medial layer of gray substance derived from that of the cortex and a lateral layer of white substance continuous with that of the cerebral hemisphere. This cavity is not developed from the cavity of the cerebral vesicles and never communicates with the ventricles of the brain. The choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle. Plexus choroideus ventriculus lateralis, paraplexus, is a highly vascular, fringe-like process of pia mater which projects into the ventricular cavity. The plexus, however, is everywhere covered by a layer of epithelium continuous with the epithelial lining of the ventricle. It extends from the interventricular foramen, where it is joined with the plexus of the opposite ventricle, to the end of the inferior cornu. The part in relation to the body of the ventricle forms the vascular fringed margin of a triangular process of pia mater, named the telechoroidea of the third ventricle, and projects from under cover the lateral edge of the fornix. It lies upon the upper surface of the thalamus, from which the epithelium is reflected over the plexus onto the edge of the fornix. This portion, in relation to the inferior cornu, lies in the concavity of the hippocampus and overlaps the fimbria hippocampi. From the lateral ends of the fimbria, the epithelium is reflected over the plexus onto the roof of the cornu. It consists of minute and highly vascular villous processes, each with an afferent and an efferent vessel. The arteries of the plexus are A. the anterior choroidal, a branch of the internal carotid which enters the plexus at the end of the inferior cornu, and B. the posterior choroidal, one or two small branches of the posterior cerebral which passes forward under the splenium. The veins of the choroid plexus unite to form a tortuous vein which courses from behind forward to the interventricular foramen and there joins with the terminal vein to form the corresponding intercerebral vein. When the choroid plexus is pulled away, the continuity between its epithelial covering and the epithelial lining of the ventricle is severed, and a cleft-like space is produced. This is named the choroidal fissure. Like the plexus, it extends from the interventricular foramen to the end of the inferior cornu. The upper part of the fissure, that is, the part nearest the interventricular foramen, is situated between the lateral edge of the fornix and the upper surface of the thalamus. Farther back, at the beginning of the inferior cornu, is between the commencement of the fimbria hippocampi and the posterior end of the thalamus, while in the inferior cornu, it lies between the fimbria in the floor and the stria terminalis in the roof of the cornu. The telechoroidea of the third ventricle. Telechoroidea ventriculus tertii, velum interpositum, is a double fold of pia mater, triangular in shape, which lies beneath the fornix. The lateral portions of its lower surface rest upon the thalami, while its medial portion is in contact with the epithelial roof of the third ventricle. Its apex is situated at the interventricular foramen. Its base corresponds with the splenium of the corpus callosum, and occupies the interval between that structure above and the corpora quadrigemini and pineal body below. This interval, together with the lower portions of the choroidal fissures, is sometimes spoken of as the transverse fissure of the brain. At its base, the two layers of the velum separate from each other and are continuous with the pia mater investing the brain in this region. Its lateral margins are modified to form the highly vascular choroid plexuses of the lateral ventricles. It is supplied by the anterior and posterior choroidal arteries already described. The veins of the telechoroidea are named the internal cerebral veins, venae galenae. They are 2 in number and run backward between its layers, each being formed at the interventricular foramen by the union of the terminal vein with the choroidal vein. The internal cerebral veins unite posteriorly in a single trunk, the great cerebral vein, vena magna galenae, which passes backward beneath the splenium and ends in the straight sinus. End of section 16.